A major development today in the Conservative leadership race. An Ontario court has ruled that Jim Karahalios can be allowed back in as a candidate. He was kicked out in March for making remarks rival candidate Erin O'Toole complained were racist. The CBC's Catherine Cullen joins us with more on this. Hey, Catherine.
Hey, Vashi.
So walk us through how all of this played out. Originally, why Mr. Karahalios, was kicked out of the race.
Yeah, we've got to cast our mind back to pre-pandemic times, Vashi, when the Conservative leadership race was just trucking along as about normal. February, March, Jim Karahalios, somebody who is considered, he's been called a gadfly. He is Mr. Axe the carbon tax. He is considered a provocateur by some. He's been involved in legal battles with the Ontario PC party. Well, he sends out some messages, Facebook, email, whatnot, in which he says that Mr. O'Toole's campaign chair is in favor, according to Mr. Karahalios, of Sharia law. Erin O'Toole not too happy about this. He goes to the Conservative Party's chief returning officer and says, I'm not happy about this. I think it's racist. I think he should be disqualified from the race. At this point, we descend in something to a word salad of party politics. You've got the CRO, you've got the DRAC, the LEOC, the Leadership Election Organizing Committee. Various pieces of the Conservative infrastructure get involved here. And what they decide to do, ultimately it is the DRAC, one of those committees, says Mr. Karahalios is out of the race. Now, an Ontario court judge has said that committee, well, they can't kick Mr. Karahalios out of the race. That particular committee doesn't have the authority to do that. Mr. Karahalios does say, listen, I'm not racist. And frankly, he believes the party is out to get him. The judge said there is no evidence of that, but certainly that this particular committee did not have the authority. So he's going to be reinstated as a candidate, but he certainly has at least one challenge in front of him, Bashi. He has to raise $100,000 in the next couple of weeks because he racked up some fines and penalties related to those remarks that he made. The other thing to consider in all of this is another piece of that word salad, the Leadership Election Organizing Committee, LEOC. They do still have the power to boot Mr. Karahalios out of the race, so they need to take a look at this situation. The judge says they need to be open-minded, but they can consider whether or not he should still be a candidate in this race if they choose to.
Yeah, my understanding of the decision was specifically that LEOC completely has that power. The judge was pretty explicit about that. And I also understand that they don't need a new complaint, for example, to investigate his leadership. They can meet tomorrow, if they so choose, and decide that Mr. Karahalios can't be a candidate. I'll ask him about that in a moment. But overall, this is one of the only things that is happening on the sidelines of the pandemic that isn't focused on the spread of COVID-19. But what does it mean for the race?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly if Jim Karahalios really is back in this race, it's quite a shakeup. When you look at the nature of the particular complaint that he was facing here, he is not somebody who is afraid to, let's say, push the envelope, certainly offend other candidates to the point that he had Mr. O'Toole alleging that some of the comments that he had made were racist. So it would certainly really shake up the race. The question is whether or not he will indeed remain in the race. What is the correct committee, now that we've gotten to that point, going to decide to do? Mr. Karahalios, to, a provocateur, just his comments, even though he wouldn't necessarily be considered in the top tier of candidates because he does like to shake things up, it could shake this race up. So what's going to happen? Certainly we asked the Conservative Party for comment. They made a point of noting in a statement that the judge did find that there was no bias against Mr. Karahalios. They say that they're looking at all of this, trying to decide what to do right now. Mr. Karahalios looking at how he can get back in the race. I did ask Mr. O'Toole's camp for a comment as well. They say essentially this is between Jim Karahalios and LEOC, the Leadership Election Organizing Committee. I got it right there, Bash.
I appreciate you making sense of that word salad very much, Catherine. The CBC's Catherine Cullen with that update. So will Karahalios jump back into the race? Jim Karahalios joins me from Cambridge, Ontario. Hi, Mr. Karahalios. Good to see you again.
Thank you for having me, Bashi.
Are you going to try to get back in the race following this decision?
Well, today we had an important decision for the rule of law. Disqualification was overturned, but the courts don't allow for judicial review. And so there's a CRO ruling that stands that has put me at a disadvantage for this race. I have to come up with $100,000, so a $400,000 buy-in. The other four candidates had a $300,000 buy-in. We haven't heard from the party since the court's decision. There's donations that we've sent that are still at the post office. They haven't picked up for 2 months. They haven't opened up the online donor portal where people can directly donate to the party, to my campaign. So unless we've got the party willing to play ball here and run a fair race and accept donations for my campaign, I physically don't have a way right now to collect donations to send to them for the extra $100,000. And the CRO in this race has wide latitude to do whatever he wants. He's got more power than Andrew Scheer in our party. And I'm hoping the party will respond to our campaign and ensure that a fair process is going to continue the rest of the way, not sanction one candidate, me, $100,000 for campaign communications, and not sanction the rest when they've been criticized for their own positions. The
argument that you just put forth about the fairness of the process was fundamental to the case that you presented as well. And in the decision, one part, well, many parts, but one part in particular speaks to that. In my opinion, the process afforded Mr. Karahalios was fundamentally fair. In essence, what the judge said was you knew what you were signing up for, the powers that the party had to make judgments when it came to your candidacy. You agreed to those conditions, and as a result, there was nothing unfair about the process. So why do you come to the conclusion now that there was something unfair?
So the judge makes that decision on the evidence provided. And when the party goes to court, doesn't provide affidavits from the CRO or the appeals committee members who made the decision. Only one individual of the LEOC provided an affidavit. We don't know what the discussions were amongst the election organizing committee that led to the CRO's $100,000 fine. And look, you've seen other candidates in this race make campaign communications that have been criticized. They have yet to be sanctioned. So obviously the rules are being applied differently to my campaign communications and theirs. And the judge said the evidence on the file in a 2-month trial was not enough to come to that conclusion. But I had to go to court to get a disqualification. And the courts do not review internal decisions of political parties on their merits. They only review whether the party followed the rules as written. So what that means is that a judge can't look at the CRO's sanction of $100,000 and say whether that was flawed or not, because it clearly was flawed if you read our policy declaration and you read our Constitution. But that's outside the judge's scope in this review. He can only look at the rules and decide whether disqualification was fair.
I'll read for our viewers exactly what he said. I pause to say and to foreshadow that it is not for the court to say whether the substantive aspects of the CRO's ruling, and I should say this is the ruling that decided it, so our viewers who might not be aware of all the circumstances of the case, that's the ruling that decided that the communication you sent out that Mr. O'Toole complained about went against the rules, and they penalized you for that. So the judge said, it is not for the court to say whether the substantive aspects of the CRO's ruling were unreasonable, reasonable, true, or correct. But the judge also goes on to say that even though you tried to argue that it should be that there should be a judgment on that, Mr. Karahalios was not a witness to some of the major events upon which his case is built. Mr. Karahalios, who was cross-examined, told his story and provided a great deal of hearsay evidence, some of which was told to him by persons who Mr. Karahalios wished to keep confidential to protect their privacy. His case is largely built upon what happened at telephone conference calls or meetings at which he was not present. So you're making some pretty substantive claims, Mr. Karahalios, against the party, against their motivations, and the judge says that those are baseless.
I don't think he said they're baseless. I think he said that I don't have the evidence to go to court and ask the judge to decide why I was sanctioned $100,000 and other candidates in this race were not. And that's the reality of the situation when decisions are made in secret. But Vashi, you have to ask yourself, if everything was up on the up and up, how come they didn't disclose in the court process what the discussions were amongst the LEOC that led to the CRO fining me $100,000? How come only one person provided affidavit evidence? So there's obviously stuff that they didn't want to reveal to the public. And when the judge makes those comments, he's making it on the evidentiary record that's available to me and what's provided. And if the party's not coming forward with that information in a trial, I'm not in a very good position in a short 1-month trial to access those documents in that discussion. But at the end of the day, they disqualified me from a race, Vashi. They didn't follow their own rules, and the judge decided that. And
the judge decided the wrong people disqualified you, right? The people who ultimately said you couldn't be a candidate for leadership, that was the wrong grouping of people. But he did say that LEOC had the power to do so. And you know from the rules you signed up to that LEOC can do that.
Right, and they voted and they didn't disqualify me. And then the other committee that didn't follow their own rules removed me from the ballot. Those are the facts.
So the question is then, if this does go back to LEOC, Is it your understanding, it's my understanding based on this ruling, and I could be wrong, but that if that question were to be put in front of LEOC and LEOC were to decide you are no longer a candidate, that according to this ruling, they have the ability to do so?
So you have to ask yourself, why is double jeopardy happening in this situation when they voted once already and didn't disqualify me? And why are those deliberations not happening for the other candidates in the race who've made inflammatory comments that have been criticized both inside and outside the party? You have to ask yourself that question on that hypothesis. The party might decide to dig in here and not allow a fair race to happen. I know that when I was removed from the ballot, I was in third place with donations. I've never had access to the 300,000 emails of the party list that the other four candidates had. We reached the $300,000 in donations despite that, and we're climbing in popularity and support across this country. And those are all facts in this case. And so I don't know.
It's also a fact, with respect, Mr. Karahalios, it's also a fact, according to the judge, that the party, until Erin O'Toole launched this complaint, did nothing to stand in the way of your candidacy. And actually, the judge found merit to Erin O'Toole's complaint levied against you, saying it's not a stretch to say that this is a case of race baiting, defined in the Oxford Dictionary as the unfair use of statements about race to try to influence the actions or attitudes of a particular group of people. He went on to say that you're a smart person, you trained as a lawyer, and that you tried to walk a line. You were careful to use specific quotes.
That I was race baiting.
Yeah,
and I quoted Erin O'Toole's campaign chair, and I said I disagree with him. That's all fair and on the record. If he thought I said something libelous, he could have sued me. Look, I've been maligned from the top, and anytime you fight the establishment and whether they follow their own rules, I continually get maligned, and that's fine. We can continue maligning me after I just won in court for a party not following their own rules. And I reject the premise of the statement. I've rejected it from day one.
Do you reject the judge's ruling, though, on it? Do you reject the judge's comments on it?
The judge's ruling is that I won. And the fact of the matter is Erin O'Toole filed a complaint to remove me from the race when he himself sent an email out criticizing and taking the same position that I did, using more inflammatory language than I did on Sharia law in this country.
The judge explicitly...
he was not sanctioned.
No, the judge explicitly said, it all combined to a conclusion that it appears that Mr. Karahalios was trying to do precisely what he says that he was not, using charged and Islamophobic language to attack a fellow candidate and a campaign volunteer in order to score points. That's from the judge. Those are the words of the judge.
No. That's Vashi. That's not what the judge said. The judge copied and pasted what the CRO said in his decision. And the judge said that he is not in a position to take a review of the CRO's ruling. He copied and pasted what the CRO said about me, and he hasn't sanctioned or investigated any other candidate in this race. That's the CRO's opinion. And he has a lot of power in this race. The judge did not weigh in on a critique of my communication because there was nothing there on that.
But doesn't the CRO have the power to make that decision?
The CRO under these rules has the power to make flawed decisions, and the court can't intervene. That's our legal system in this country. It's a vacuum when it comes to what political parties do when they apply the rules, and it has to be a clear violation of them breaking the rules, just like they did when they removed me from the ballot. But don't quote what the CRO said and suggest that that's what the judge said, because he didn't say that. The CRO said that. And you got to ask yourself, why is the CRO saying that about me for saying I disagree with statements published in a newspaper about a campaign chair in this race? And he hasn't said it about the other four candidates in this race, three of them who've used very inflammatory language in this race.
Have there been specific complaints levied against those candidates, though? Isn't that part of the process? Like Erin O'Toole made a complaint about you.
The CRO has the power to investigate a complaint or deny it. In this case, he decided to proceed. He also has the power to start his own investigation. So if the rule of law and the rules are being applied fairly, you got to ask yourself, why is he green-lighting an investigation from Erin O'Toole, who I am his biggest threat in the race, running as a blue Tory on the right, and he's not opening up an investigation for other inflammatory language that the other candidates made in this race? It's not, you can't just hide behind the fact that a competitor in this race used this as a political tool to file a complaint about me, and the other candidates in this race haven't done the same thing. So it's okay to disqualify a guy if his competitor complains about him, but we'll turn a blind eye to other comments made.
So let me ask you then, at the end of the day, Leoc still does, according to the judgment, have, or the decision, the power to decide whether or not you remain as a candidate. The stuff you're talking about now, you're ascribing motive to a lot of the people who work on Leoc, who make these decisions ultimately. Do you think that's ultimately going to help your case? You want to remain as a candidate, right?
Well, if they're neutral officials running a race, Vashi, is that even a question you should be asking me? Should they be keeping quiet and behind closed doors the decisions and the motivations for their decisions and not disclosing it in the court process or to the members at large? If you're a neutral official running a race, should you be weighing in on my campaign communications and sanctioning me $100,000 and letting the other candidates off the hook? What's the difference?
But the judge did say nothing was wrong with that. Like, the judge was pretty unequivocal. Nothing was wrong with the process.
Vashi,
except for who decided ultimately.
Vashi, he said the rules provide the CRO with broad language to interpret policy communications, and the court doesn't have the jurisdiction under our legal system to do a judicial review of what the CRO decides in the case. He didn't say that everything the CRO did was fine, because he didn't review what the CRO did.
No, but he said the CRO had the power to make that decision.
Under these rules, because the CRO, under the rules that...
But those are the rules you knew existed.
The rules that I signed up for were a take it or leave it proposition that I thought were going to be applied equally to all the candidates in this race. That's what the rule of law is. And in this scenario, they're applying it differently to me than the others. The courts have always been reluctant, Vashi, to find a decision against the political party in this country. I don't think you can pull up any other person in Canada that's beat a political party in court in the middle of an election. I've been persecuted by the PC party suing me. I won. And now I've taken the Conservative Party to court because they withheld my campaign contributions and illegally disqualified me from a race. And I won. And those are the facts. And we don't have a legal system that allows the courts or Elections Canada to take more of a role in an internal party election to make sure the rules are applied fairly. So it's up to the party. It's up to the leadership committee and the CRO and the appeals committee. Do they want to run a fair race? Are they going to start accepting my campaign contributions? Are they going to put me on a level playing field with the other candidates or not? It's up to them.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Karahalios. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Time for, of course, the Power Panel to weigh in. In Toronto, Amanda Alvaro of Pomp and Circumstance joins us. Summa Strategies' Tim Powers is in Ottawa, as is Kathleen Monk of Earnscliffe Strategy Group. Hi to all three of you. Great to see you.
Hi.
So, Tim, pretend for a second that you sit on the leadership organizing committee of the Conservative Party.
I in 2004, when Stephen Harper got elected.
I recall. So pretend it's 15 years ago or 16 years ago, and you are tasked with deciding now whether or not to disqualify Mr. Karahalios, because the judgment did say that Leoc does have the power to do so. What do you decide?
Let him in, because if you don't let him in, the story is going to continue anyway. The unfortunate thing about this leadership race is it's been stories like this, people being excluded, offensive remarks, inappropriate remarks. Where are the big ideas? Where are the big debates? I think they just move forward. They let him in if he can pay the $100,000, which may be tough to do in the 2-week period that you've outlined. But Mr. Karahalios, will do himself in, I suspect, by his own campaign style. So rather than making him a martyr or a victim of a system that is, as he argues, rigged against him, let him in and let him sink or swim like the boy behind me on his own accord.
To your point, to Tim's point, Kathleen, part of what Mr. Karahalios used or the argument he used to defend himself was that, other candidates have said way more inflammatory things, and the party's only investigating me. What does that tell you about the race?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think actually the loser in all of this is actually the Conservative Party and in fact, Leoc, in terms of the organization of the race. I think it doesn't really reflect badly on them, but I think it reflects badly, on them. But I think I would take Tim's take and let him in, so it kind of kills the story. It'll be another name on the ballot for Election Day. He won't, I'll put my money on it, he won't become leader. But the question is, who does benefit from Karahalios being on the ballot? And he said to you in his interview that, he feels that he's on the right of the party, more like Erin O'Toole, and so that it would be his intention to kind of draw down support or continue to attack Erin O'Toole. So what does that mean for the landscape of the race overall? I think that's the question. And the question of whether he can even get on the ballot, as Tim mentioned, in these 2 weeks, raising that $100,000. He's a pretty formidable fundraiser. So that's not the hugest obstacle. He could overcome it if he wanted to. But the real question I think that people should be asking themselves is, what does this mean for the dynamics of the overall race and first ballot, second ballot, third ballot kind of support?
Yeah, and that is the really interesting question going forward, Amanda. If he does become a candidate again, because of the ranked ballot, it's important if he's somebody's second choice.
For sure, and I think he's speaking with enough confidence to suggest that he thinks he can raise that $100,000 in this 2-week time period. It doesn't sound like it will be the obstacle that will take him out. I mean, I think if he's going to go through the process of the court system and come out with this judgment and is prepared to do the rounds in media to get his story out, this is somebody who wants to go all the way. He also mentioned that he was third in terms of donations. So this was somebody who had at least some momentum and not somebody who was kind of like a fringe candidate. But this is messy, messy, messy. This has sort of shades of Bernier written on it, because when you oust somebody who's able to drive some of those headlines, who can be chirping from the sidelines, that could be a huge problem from the party going forward. However, I'll disagree a little bit with what Tim and Kathleen said, because I think because the judgment wasn't about what was said or not said, it was about the fact that the improper body made the decision. I think the party has to now consider it based on principle. I mean, do they do the right thing and allow for the correct body to make the same decision that they would have otherwise made? Or do they let this stand and say, well, you know what, we may have done it improperly, so we might as well let the guy back in? I think that that's a very difficult message for the party to deal with. And I think, this is a party who doesn't want somebody on the sidelines yapping the entire way through to August 21st. I think that presents a bigger challenge for them going forward.
Tim, if you look at yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say this is fascinating, right, on a number of levels. So you'll remember Stephen Harper and others came to power railing against judge-made law. Well, judge-made law is now changing the dynamics of the Conservative leadership race. Amanda made a great point. What are other parties and this party going forward going to do about the leadership organizing committees they structure, knowing now, because there will be candidates in other parties who may find themselves in a different sort of pickle and will take a legal route and it'll circumvent the whole process. I think the bigger challenge for the Conservative Party is not to be too distracted by Mr. Karahalios and look past this. So looking past is letting him in, because the bigger challenge for the party is not today's mechanics. There's always mechanic stories in a leadership race. There's always inflammatory candidates. There's always offensive candidates, unfortunately. It's about, all right, how do we contain this damage and get to building the bigger brand of the Conservative Party, which they need to do if they want to win the next election.
And it's interesting to that effect, Kathleen, that, for example, my colleague Catherine Cullen was reporting that Erin O'Toole's campaign is saying, this is, let them fight it out. We're not going to weigh in. You haven't heard much from haven't heard anything today, at least from Peter MacKay on it. Like, nobody's eager to jump in. They appear to be trying to keep their eye on the bigger prize.
Yeah, but you have to also understand who would benefit. So maybe who's keeping mum, who might benefit from being in the race and who might not benefit from him being in the race. I think ultimately, Tim is right that every leadership race has these characters in it, but there's also another truism, and that is that those that sue their party, regardless of what party you belong to, don't often have a longer half-life afterwards. So I don't know, even though he has a very litigious background and he's sued at the provincial level as well, but I don't know how long this is his career within the Conservative Party is gonna last.
Well, it's interesting because the judge outlines throughout the decision, Amanda, that's his shtick, right? That he went in looking for a fight. And started this process doing so, and that Erin O'Toole picked up the baton and others didn't, basically. And that is sort of, and that he hasn't made a secret of that either, right? Even with the provincial PC party, he's always, and even when he tried to present himself at the beginning of this campaign, it was very much about being the outsider candidate. And you're right, echoing not the same policy positions necessarily, but in the vein of Maxime Bernier, right? Like, this is the anti-establishment candidate.
For sure. I mean, different circumstances, different people, but sort of the same shades to a certain degree. And I thought it was interesting when you look at some of the judge's comments around the fact that, he referred to him as a populist, but also an antagonist, somebody who antagonizes the parties that he's associated with, including the Ontario party. So this isn't his first kick at the can. This is somebody who's prepared to get into the corners and likes to ruffle the feathers of others and is happy to be that guy. Happy to be that kind of candidate, which makes me think that this is somebody who's out today talking about the fact that he wants back in the race. $100,000 is not going to prevent him from being there. He was up in donations. He wants to be back in. And if he's on the outside, it's probably also not going to prevent him from saying what he wants to say. But I totally agree with Kathleen. This doesn't bode well for his future within either, an Ontario party or the federal party. He's making enemies everywhere he goes, which may end up being a little bit more Bernier-esque in the coming months or years. Who knows what his long-term ambitions are?
We shall see. I do want to switch topics and get all three of you to weigh in on a COVID-19 related subject, and that is the new advice from public health officials in this country. They recommend that we wear non-medical masks when physical distancing isn't possible. Here's the Prime Minister a bit earlier today on that.
I will be wearing a mask as I go into Parliament this afternoon for our in-person sitting. Once I am at my desk in Parliament and 2 meters separate from everyone else, I will take off my mask so I can engage in parliamentary discourse. But as soon as I leave my seat and walk past people and walk through potentially busier hallways, I will be wearing a mask.
So it's interesting, Tim, because it goes from a suggestion to a recommendation. And I feel like I'm one of those people now listening to every word out of everybody's mouth. So we're all, oh boy, this is significant. It's not mandatory. And I spoke to Minister Jolie earlier in the show, and they haven't taken it off the table, but it looks like, there's no definite plans to make it mandatory. What do you think?
That's what I think. Here's mine.
Oh, there we go.
Look, Kathleen and I know this well, and as I'm sure Amanda does, in any realm of restraint health, there's always changing recommendations and changing guidelines, diet fads, whatever. Just stay away from hydroxychloroquine or whatever the hell the president's taking. But I think it makes sense. I think it makes sense. I was at a store up the road from here today, Canadian Tire. Half the people in there were wearing masks, half weren't. And I think it should be an individual's choice. And I think we've learned through the course of the pandemic that it's probably more helpful for you to wear a mask so you don't spread germs than not. So what does it hurt? If you can afford one or you have one, wear one.
Kathleen, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't know if staying home for so long and not being out in the real world has gotten me a little soft, but I actually don't see I'm not reacting to the same kind of cynicism as some of our parliamentary journalists were today with the kind of question, well, you've changed your recommendation and it's a flip-flop. I didn't see it that much. I think they've been pretty consistent on wearing a cloth mask, a homemade mask, a non-medical mask helps you to protect others, right? It's not really going to protect yourself, but it helps you by protecting others in our community. So wear one if you can't find that physical distance that we need of up to 6 feet. So I thought it was good. I think this is really from a communications perspective. I would say this is about persuasion. This is about hearts and minds, about winning people over to wear masks like this that my neighbor made for me, thankfully. And I think the reason they're doing that is because the slogan is hashtag we're all in this together. It's not hashtag put your goddamn mask on, excuse my language, but it has to be one that is more carrot than stick. We have to encourage people to be on their best behavior. We've seen stories out of the States where certain large stores are mandating people to wear masks, and it's breaking into fights at large corporations, and you see this everywhere. And I think Canadians can be encouraged with more carrot and politeness, and we're all in this together notion. So a recommendation on behalf of Dr. Theresa Tam and the Public Health Office is a good one. And I think, we could all do well by either sewing or having a crafty neighbor.
I think that's an interesting comment, Amanda, just about whether you go mandatory or whether you try to persuade. And I was interested in the question because I looked up, a lot of other countries have made it mandatory. Germany, France, a wide range of countries. And it is, I remember asking John Tory last week, who wanted to see more consistent advice. What is the, what do you want a direction? And he's like, I'm not sure Canadians are going to just, fall in line if we tell them they have to do it, but I want some consistent recommendations. So that kind of speaks to what Kathleen's saying.
Yeah, and there's, other jurisdictions have taken kind of a layered approach to where those masks might be mandatory, just like some companies have taken that layered approach in Canada. We know that airlines, for instance, will require masks, and some retail locations require masks and give them out at the door, which I think is part of the mandatory process. If you're going to make something mandatory, you have to make sure that it's available and accessible to people. The strong recommendation, though, makes a lot of sense because as provinces are opening up, people are sitting at home asking themselves, okay, now what? Like, what is the best way for me to stay safe and stay protected? And as our circumstances change so that social distancing becomes less easy, so it's one thing to do it in a grocery store, it's another potentially on public transit, it's another in some cases in an elevator or in a closer space. What else can I do beyond the hand washing and all of the other recommendations that have been made? And finding a means, an extra layer of protection, which is the way that Dr. Theresa Tam referred to it today, to keep yourself safe is the right step. Now, interestingly, the reason why I think that message has changed was because early on, I think that they were very concerned about giving people a false sense of security, that if you just wear a mask, you're going to be fine. And the problem is this has evolved and experts have weighed in during the evolution of this virus. We've become, more acquainted with the fact that there's this long incubation period and you can be with somebody and not know that they're carrying the virus. So again, an extra layer of protection at a time when social distancing may be more and more difficult to follow.
Okay, I have to leave it there, but thank you very much to all three of you for your time tonight. Thanks to Tim Powers, Amanda Alvaro, and Kathleen Monk. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.